Mass media platforms have progressed significantly over the last century. In the early 20th century, the major mediums of news were the newspaper and radio. With the creation of television in the 1950s, the network news era began. Then, in the 1980s, it expanded into the cable news era. And finally, with the digitization of technology, we now live in the social media age. Each platform covered political scandals differently due to the ongoing expansion of the news industry. Robert Moses was known to many as the master builder of the 20th century. He was seemingly above the law, tearing up occupied urban land to give substance to his vision. Moses was mainly covered by newspapers, and their coverage portrayed him as a stellar man working toward the greater good of every individual. There were only a few newspapers widely available through the first half of the 20th century, and they were easily controlled. These newspapers included the New York Tribune, the New York Journal, and the Washington Post. Moses himself bribed newspaper journalists and editors to feed them his own version of the truth. During this era, the newspapers reported without analysis and focused solely on the facts. This isn't to say that newspapers didn't lean conservative or liberal, just that their political stance was reflected in the facts that were reported, and not in the validity or analysis of those facts. Another aspect of the newspaper era is the lack of news volume. The only source of news for most Americans was their morning newspaper. Although avid consumers of the news sometimes read several newspapers, the volume of news production in general was much less. Newspaper news was top-down. The institution created the news, and the people absorbed it. With Moses' influence, he was able to convince the public to blindly accept his vision so that his developments could proceed. By bribing journalists and editors, Moses was able to use his political influence to cultivate his image in a positive way. As Williams and Deli Carpini write, the early American press, though beholden to their political masters, was also intensely personal, reflecting the views of the publisher, who usually served as editor, printer, business manager, and reporter. Moses created many public agencies and generated his income from developments such as bridge and highway tolls. By profiting from his own public creations, he collected money from citizens without the involvement of elected officials. This financial freedom effectively gave him more power than nearly anyone else in his area. It was the newspaper era that allowed one of the most polarizing figures of urban development to endure well into the decades. This manipulated, top-down institution allowed Moses to control the news, and Americans believed it. The Watergate scandal was the most significant national scandal covered during the network news era. The nature of network news coverage at the time centered around the reporting of facts, with nearly no analysis or political agenda. This resulted in a lot less confusion surrounding the scandal. The Watergate scandal centered around the illegal actions committed by the Nixon administration against Democrats, rival politicians, and political activist groups. 5 men broke into the DNC's headquarters, located in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. The scandal surfaced when the 5 men were found to be connected to President Nixon's staff. With the creation and proliferation of the television in the 1950s, came the rise of the network news era. Americans turned away from newspapers and towards the TV to get their news. Williams and Deli Carpini state, by 1963, television and newspapers were evenly ranked, and by 1967, television had become the single most popular choice for news. By 1986, just as the age of broadcast news was about to be challenged, 66% of Americans said they usually got their news from television, compared with just 36% who said newspapers, and 14% who said radio. Network news added more selection and a second cycle of news for the American public. In the morning, they'd read the paper, and in the evening, they'd sit down to watch the evening news. This added cycle also raised the volume of news that the average American ingested. Network news channels consisted of ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. people could now follow developing news stories at a much faster pace. Instead of waiting for the next day to learn about a new development, they could catch it in the evening on their television sets. A similar trend carried from the newspaper and radio era is the top-down dictation of news. The producer, or owner, would often direct the flow of news to the individual evening shows. Since there wasn't much opinion included in network news at this point, the top-down directive came in the form of which stories to report. With this tactic, shows could cater to a more conservative or liberal viewer by including or excluding stories to match their intended audience. This undoubtedly raised the level of awareness of many Americans, not just due to the raised number of news cycles available, but by the level of connection they felt to a familiar face telling them about the news nearly every night. Generally, Americans accepted the network news reporting of Watergate. A major reason for this is likely the lack of analysis on the part of the network news stations. This consistency, paired with the lack of polarizing opinions, led Americans to believe more of what was reported as news. There wasn't an immediate doubt or suspicion on the validity of news sources in this era. Bill Clinton's infamous affair with then-intern Monica Lewinsky captured the world's attention. In 1998, if one were to turn on the television, glance at a newspaper, or even open a page on the newly expanded internet, they would find many different sources regarding Clinton's affair. Cable news was becoming an ingrained aspect of American society. Journalists reported on Monica Lewinsky, and people saw what was happening in real time. This expansion of cable news to households across the country allowed news cycles to run continuously. Cable news intensified this scandal, and every American was exposed to the private life of the current president and his mistress, due to the increased access to news. Just like Princess Diana's funeral or the O.J. Simpson police chase, the excitement of watching our president's personal life unfold before our eyes made us feel more entertained and involved. Our modern culture of obsession with celebrities intensified with the rise of cable news. As Williams and Deli Carpini state, one could literally spend 24 hours a day watching, listening to, or reading about the latest chapter of the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, and, should one choose, do so without picking up a daily newspaper or tuning into a network news show. Unlike earlier years, where Americans read their morning newspaper and watched their evening news during the weekdays, now, news was readily available at every hour of the day, as well as on the weekends. This era brought forth what we now know as a 24-hour news cycle. News sources started becoming more partisan, unlike prior years where there were objective sources of reporting. Opinions started infiltrating the news. MSNBC, CNN, and Fox shifted to include partisan bias throughout their reports. In addition, the cable networks brought in talking heads and pundits, who expressed their own radical opinions and contributed to the drama and excitement of cable news. As different people in areas of the country tuned into different news channels, the American people saw the same stories in different lights. This contributed to America's political polarization. Unlike newspapers or network news that lacked analysis, during the cable news era, Americans were spoon-fed knowledge and the angles they should view the story in. Throughout the Clinton scandals, the existence of multiple news outlets, semi-news outlets, entertainment media, new hybrid genres, and the internet, all of which were covering the scandals, made it impossible for either the mainstream press or traditional political elites to ignore or downplay these scandals without further risking their own relevance to their agenda-setting process. The current investigation into Russia's influence in the 2016 presidential election cycle displays that the internet and social media era provides far too many sources and content creators for people to sift through and find the truth. Reports on Russia's involvement vary. Some internet news outlets like Breitbart on the far right assure Americans that Russia's involvement did not influence the results, or that Russia was not even involved. Others, on the far left, such as Occupy Democrats, report that Russia hacked voting machines and literally changed the results of the election. The more credible and established news sources report that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Russia did hack the DNC and John Podesta's emails, but they didn't reach into actual voting machines. These reports suggest that Russia's influence simply made Americans doubt the Democratic candidate. Reports vary so significantly in the era of the internet and social media that it is hard to differentiate between real and fake news. News in this era is hyper-partisan and bottom-up. Anyone with access to the internet has the ability to create content and share it. The masses dictate the news because everyone has the ability to create it. Coupled with social media's algorithms, internet news tends to create echo chambers in which content you don't agree with is algorithmically filtered out. Thus, Americans are exposed to fewer sources that are more partisan. Today, the number of sources at our disposal continues to grow exponentially. Currently, 66% of Americans get their news online, and 63% use a smartphone to do so. The rapid proliferation of news sources available to us has resulted in a breakdown of the standards that previously guided the field of journalism. As Williams and Deli Carpini state, in the end, transparency is important, not only so that viewers can assess the trustworthiness of what they are viewing, reading, or hearing, but also because it encourages those who step onto the media soapbox to take responsibility for what they are saying. It is not difficult to see the decline of this standard of transparency. Our current president, Donald Trump, seems to lack the level of responsibility that Williams and Deli Carpini believe is crucial to effective media systems. The growing necessity for sites to be constantly posting new content, coupled with the lack of fact-checking, allows people to claim the accuracy of facts that they see posted online without checking to see if those facts are coming from objective, unbiased sources. Furthermore, in this era, many people are prone to reading headlines of news articles instead of the articles themselves, and they rapidly click to share. The way Americans get their news has changed drastically in the last century. The news reports of political scandals during the different eras reflect the changing world of journalism, news, and American mass media. With each technological advancement and increase in news sources, Americans are fighting to keep up and find the facts.